go. Welcome. So the rough plan is Steve is going to be doing a introduction to begin with, and then Ellen Tone will be giving a bit of a background on our heat pump experience or heat pump experiences. And then we have a special tutorial with Sheila and Norm who are interested in getting heat pumps. So kind of Steve can talk with them about some of the questions that come up and how do you go about thinking about this stuff. And then at the end, we'll have a Q&A period and then try and wrap up by 8:30. So that's beginning. And thank you all for coming and look forward to hearing your questions. So Steve, go ahead and take it away.
All right. Thanks, John. Nice to see a lot of familiar faces and some new faces here, and old friends and new friends. So I'm going to share my screen. Once I start doing that, I get kind of wrapped up in talking. I'll talk for, I'm going to try to keep it to 20 minutes, and then we'll hear from Ellen for a few minutes. And then I'm going to use what I do is coach individual homeowners on getting heat pumps. And so we're going to have a mini coaching session with Sheila and Norm and see how that goes. And if we get through that, then there'll be more time for Q&A. And so let's get started. But John, maybe if somebody's raising their hand or trying to get my attention and I don't notice it, you can flag me.
I will do that, and also I'll be monitoring the chat. So if people have questions and they don't want to forget their question because Steve's on a roll, just go ahead and put it in the chat and we'll come back to it.
Okay. So I'll just mention I'm co-founder of an organization called the Heat Smart Alliance, and it grew out of Heat Smart programs that were sponsored by the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, which is a state entity. And we now have coaches like me working in 5 or 6 other towns. We need thousands of coaches because we're getting a lot of demand for our services. We're all volunteers. So what I hope you'll learn today is that green heating and cooling means heat pumps, why that matters for our climate, and then we'll get into which type of heat pump may be best for your home. And the Mass Save program, which is the main incentive program for heat pumps, has big changes for 2022. And so I'll summarize those incentives and then talk about where you go from here. So why heat pumps? Well, in New England, about 30% of the total energy use is residential, and out of that 30%, and this is looking at a typical home in New England, about over 60% is spent on heating and cooling, another 17% or so on hot water. Clothes drying is about 2%, and other uses would be lighting and cooking and other energy, running your computers in your home and so forth. So out of that home energy use is about 80% of the energy load can be handled by heat pumps. And that's important because heat pumps are the more efficient way of doing heating and cooling than conventional heating systems. So the path, we are within Massachusetts, we have a new climate bill last March that commits us to achieving a 50% reduction statewide in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and being carbon neutral by 2050. So that requires a lot of work on all of the couple million homes in Massachusetts. And so for each home, the typical steps are to weatherize, which means air sealing and insulating, electrifying the home, heating and cooling, also installing charging stations for electric vehicles, and then shifting to renewable electricity. And you can get started on all of these steps right now. And some of them make more economic sense than others. And so we'll talk about when it makes economic sense to convert your heating system to electrify the heating system. And of course, that once you're electrified, then that has to be powered by green electricity. So what is a heat pump? This is going to be a very, very simple explanation. It moves heat it pumps heat from a cooler place to a warmer place. And if you think about it, you've already got a bunch of heat pumps in your home. We just don't call them that. So if you have a refrigerator in your home, who doesn't? That's a heat pump. If you have dehumidifiers, air conditioners, those are heat pumps. They all fit the definition in the first line. So they're now, what we're not familiar with is that they're now available for heating and cooling in this cold climate. You know, if you look back 15 years or so ago, they weren't really an efficient solution for our climate, except for there were some types, but they're less common. But today, the technology has improved to the point where it is competitive in our climate. And it's also available for water heating and clothes drying and pool heating. So, you know, again, at a very simple level, if you put in 1 unit of electricity, the heat pump takes in 2 units of heat from the outdoor air. Even though it's much colder than the indoor air, it's able to absorb heat energy from the outdoor air and into the home. So you end up with 3 units of heat in the home roughly for 1 unit of electricity input. And that's much better than if you had an electric resistance heater, that would be 1-to-1. If you have a fossil fuel system, it's actually for 1 unit of energy input, you're lucky to get 95%. In some cases for oil systems, it's maybe 85% or lower of the input energy into the home. In terms of emissions reduction, it's quite substantial. And this is based on looking at, there are 2 sets of bars here. One is for today's grid electricity, and the other is for what it has to be in 2040 by various mandates on the power companies to green the energy. So if you look at this in terms of emissions reduction, the heat pump is, you know, there are 2 types that we'll talk about: air source heat pumps, and that's what I'm for existing homes. That's the most common solution, but I'll also mention ground source heat pumps, which are even more efficient, however, have come with some extra complications that I'll talk about briefly. And you can see that there's a substantial emissions reduction. This is a typical 2,000 square foot home. You're going from, if you're using fuel oil today, from 5 tons to maybe 1 ton of emissions per year using grid electricity. Now, if your electricity is 100% green from solar or wind, then you're completely eliminating the emissions.
Yeah, it's all eliminated.
So even versus natural gas, using a heat pump with grid electricity is a considerable reduction. So what type of heat pump might be right for your home? And it turns out that in coaching, I've coached close to 50 different homeowners now. Every home is unique. There's some special circumstances, and we'll see that later when we're talking to Sheila and Norm. So there are essentially 2 types of distribution systems: hydronic, which means you have baseboards with hot water, or possibly a steam system with radiators, like the old-fashioned ones on the lower left here, and something called a boiler in your basement or somewhere in your home. The other type is forced air, and in that case, the fossil fuel burning monster in the basement is called a furnace, a boiler, and you get air moving through the home through ducting typically. So, and then there's a variety of other, there are some homes around here that were built with only electric baseboards. It's terrifically expensive to heat with that. It's almost a no-brainer to convert from that to heat pumps. And then there are various combinations. For example, homes that have hydronic heat often were retrofitted, or in some cases built new with separate ducting for air conditioning. And there can be standard size ducting as well as something called high velocity ducting. That's a very small diameter tubes that were retrofitted into homes. So let me stop there. I'm going to take this off share for a minute and try to do a hand poll. I want to see how many of you have a hydronic heating system.
Have a
Have
what?
what?
Hydronic. Where was the hand? See,
Just raise your regular hand.
oh,
Does that include radiators?
About 5 or 6. And how many of you have forced air? Maybe 3. And how many of you have something other, some weird combination of the two?
Oh, I don't live in a home. I just wanted to listen to see in case we buy a home. We live in an apartment building, so I don't really know what we have.
Oh, okay. All right. And anybody who doesn't know, don't be embarrassed. All right. All right, good. So I typically find roughly 50-50, maybe more hydronic in this area. All right, so let me go back to sharing the screen. All right, so if you have existing hydronic system, then the most straightforward solution usually is a ductless mini split system. It's a type of air source heat pump. And so you've probably seen these around. These wall units are becoming more and more common. Maybe you have them in your home or you have them in your friend's home. And they started out as single zone systems. You'd have one outdoor unit and one indoor unit, but nowadays they have multi-zone or multi-split systems where you can have multiple wall units attached, and they have quite flexible configurations. Instead of a wall unit, you can have a floor unit or you can have a ceiling cassette. And it gets even more interesting. They now have what are called compact ducted systems that can serve a couple of rooms at a time, as well as complete air handlers. So it starts to overlap with the second type of system that I'll talk about, which is central air. So if you have existing ducting, then you could still connect it to one of these so-called mini split condensers or outdoor units. There's also, and I'll just mention this briefly, something called air to water heat pumps. They're also air source heat pumps. And it's possible to, in some cases, to reuse existing baseboards and radiators and radiant flooring. However, most of the equipment for this is imported, tends to be 30% more costly than these more common ductless mini splits. If you have forced air, meaning you have existing ductwork, and the ductwork has to be suitable, meaning it's adequately sized, it's insulated for during cooling season. You don't want cold ducts that are uninsulated because they'll weep condensation and cause moisture problems. But assuming the ducting's adequate, then you can go with something called a central heat pump. They look very much and almost identical to central air conditioning units. They could be connected to a furnace in the basement. Typically the furnace is underneath. There's something called a coil on top of it. Or if you have a dedicated ducting system for air conditioning, then you have something called an air handler in the home, and that could be connected. In some cases, you can completely remove the furnace and just replace it with an air handler connected to the ducting. And then finally, there's one other type. These get their energy from pumping water through a ground loop called a ground source heat pump. The ground below, a few feet below ground level, stays at 50 to 55 degrees year round. And so you can, they're actually more efficient, but you have to bring a drill rig into your property that disrupts landscaping and has to drill a couple of wells often and connect that to the ground source heat pump in the basement, which is in turn connected to the ductwork. There are federal tax credits for these systems that aren't available for air source heat pumps. So the economics can work out, but usually for existing homes, the installation can be formidable and puts off, what I've found, puts off quite a few homeowners. Finally, I'll just quickly mention that, as I said before, heat pumps are available as water heaters. They're called hybrid water heaters because they usually have both a heat pump and electric resistance elements. They can, result in high energy savings and pretty fast payback in 5 to 6 years from certainly versus the cost of putting in a standard electric water heater. Putting in a hybrid water heater will more than pay for itself over the life of the system. These can be installed by plumbers, and there's a mass save rebate as well as a modest federal tax credit for these systems. So here's the $64,000 question. How much will it cost? And here it becomes a question of what do you want to spend money on? That shiny new Tesla in the driveway is a lot more fun than replacing that fossil burning monster in the basement, or putting shiny solar cells on the roof is more fun. But you have to keep in mind heating's a necessity, and so it is something that you have to expect you're going to spend some dollars on it at some point when your heating system ages out. And so when to consider this, because it is a considerable cost, it really makes the most economic sense for existing homes when the heating or the cooling system is over 15 years old. The air conditioners actually tend to age more than the heating system, so maybe the air conditioner that drives the replacement. And oftentimes, if you're going to change to a heat pump, you're going to end up either, if you could abandon the fossil system entirely, but you'll be replacing both the air conditioning system and the heating system, which makes this to get an efficient system in place. There are some homes in the area that don't have air conditioning, and then it makes a lot of sense to not just put in an air conditioner, but put in a heat pump because it provides heating and cooling. I say that often enough. Sometimes people ask me after this talk, well, does it cool too? Yes, heat pumps also do cooling. If you're planning an addition or a major renovation, then you should certainly be thinking about using a heat pump for 100% of the heating needs. That's quite viable now. And then as for water heaters, conventional glass-lined water heaters typically have a life of 7 to 10 years. So that's the point where you want to think about replacing them. Rebates for the new program for Mass Save, these rebates are some of these are considerably higher than previously. So if you replace, if you go 100% heat pump, in other words, providing 100% of the home's heat load with a ground source heat pump, there's a $15,000 incentive. If you do it with an air source heat pump, regardless of whether you have oil, propane, or gas as your existing fuel, and you have to sign a form that commits that you're going to use the heat pump all the time, except in unusual situations, power outages and such, then there's a $10,000 incentive. Or if you want to do a dual system, which is what Ellen's going to talk about, those are for many existing homes, that's often the way to go, is to use the heat pump to supplement the conventional system and displace that fuel. $1,250 per ton. A typical home requires 3 to 5 tons of capacity. So you can see the rebate's going to be in the range of maybe close to $4,000 to $7,000. All of the systems are eligible for $25,000 0% heat loan. With inflation raising its ugly head these days, that's a pretty good deal. In fact, this loan now can go up to $50,000, and in some cases that's needed. There are federal tax credits on the ground source heat pump, the total installation cost. There's a 22% ground source heat pump credit. And then there's a lifetime $500 credit on air source heat pumps and heat pump water heaters. That's a federal tax credit. So in terms of energy cost, the ground source heat pumps are competitive with natural gas. This was done, this chart is now 6 months old, so energy costs are shifting right now, and I haven't had a chance to update it, but natural gas is still somewhat less expensive to heat than an air source heat pump. Air source heat pumps are competitive with fuel oil, should be notably cheaper than propane as an annual energy cost, and then much cheaper than using electric baseboards. So if you're using, doing a lot of either electric baseboards or little portable space heater, electric space heaters to keep your home warm, you might benefit from selectively adding a heat pump to a ductless mini split, maybe to solve that problem instead of relying on the on those space heaters. So what to do next? Get informed. Heat Smart Alliance /learn. We have the link for learn is pretty obvious on the Heat Smart Alliance homepage. We have a bunch of our favorite resources there, including links to the Mass Go Clean campaign. That's a campaign by the Mass Clean Energy Center with some very good literature. You want to get a free Mass Save Home Energy assessment. They will do weatherization as much as that program allows, and it's reimbursed a minimum of 75%, 100% if there's if it's a situation where there's financial need, and then get quotes from heating cooling installers, and really every home is unique. I typically advise people to get at least 3 quotes because each installer has different equipment offerings and different ideas about what to do. And so once you get those quotes, you can make decisions about which way to go and factor in installer reputation and cost as well. So with that, let me go over to Ellen, and maybe Ellen, tell us, I prepared one slide. This is your home in Wayland, and this was a photo you took after you had your system installed. So tell us a little bit about it.
Great. Thanks, Steve. So I made a few little notes to myself. So here was our deal. We put in a heat pump about 2 years ago. Our gas system was getting to be a little over 20 years old. And so I thought I'm going to replace it before it dies, which is, I would always advise, don't wait. Once your system dies and you're in an emergency situation, that's the worst time to make this decision. So we were just going to get, we have forced hot air gas systems. We actually had 3. There were 3 on different floors, the way the builder had built the house. So I got a few quotes on those, and then a friend who Steve knows, who works with them in the Heat Smart Alliance, and I'm kind of a super environmentalist, said, you should really look at a heat pump. And I was like, really? Do they really work well enough? I don't know. And then that sent me down the path, which I'm very grateful towards, to doing what Steve called the hybrid system. So we had gotten 4 quotes for gas systems, and I got 4 more quotes for hybrid systems. And this basically, and I would say we're very happy. The way the system works is it heats our home on electricity using the heat pump down to a certain temperature, and that is set in the controls for the system. And we opted for a pretty good heat pump, not the coldest climate heat pump because of the economics. So for ours at above 25 degrees, it's down to 25 degrees, we're heating with electricity. After below 25 degrees, and we probably could have set it at 20 or 15, we've been experimenting, it switches over to gas. I don't do anything, the system just switches itself. So my calculations, because I'm pretty nerdy, I thought this, because gas is so cheap and electricity is a little more expensive, I thought this was going to be a penalty for us about $100 a year. I thought I was going to pay about $100 a year more because we were heating with electricity versus gas at those temperatures. I would say that has turned out not to be true. There has not been a penalty. And we've lived kind of in the worst case scenario. which is that in the last 3 years, we've had way more people living in our house than we had in the previous years because all of our kids were living with us during COVID. And so this was a worst case scenario for occupancy. So we have not ended up having a penalty paying more for electricity. The second thing I would say is with heat pumps, the rule is you set it and you forget it. We had always been, you set it, we kept our house pretty cold, like 64, 65, except for my little office, which I heated. We slept at cold temperatures, around 60. We like to sleep cold. With a heat pump, they don't like that. You set it and forget it. So our house is sort of set at 68 all the time, which is definitely more comfortable for me working at home. And John's office moved to home during COVID, so also more comfortable for him. So we had better comfort. We have a Bryant system, which is very similar to Carrier. I love the controls. They're very easy to use on the wall, and it has a great app. So the vacation setting, the just making adjustments is fantastic. And Steve saw our controls, and that was one of the selling features. So the controls work great. So we've been really happy. I think the only thing I don't like is that sort of set it and forget it. I kind of like the ability to knock it down at night, but that turns out to make the system inefficient and ends up costing more based on some other studies that I looked at. I would also say we have a ductless mini split in our condo in Vermont, which we installed about 6 years ago. So that's just hangs out on the wall, has a unit outside on the terrace. 6 years ago, so the systems weren't as good as they are now, but it's been -20. We've been in Vermont a lot. It's been -20 a lot of days without the wind chill. And that heat pump chugs along fine down to 0. At about -15, our supplemental system comes on. But I think it's chugging pretty well. It's a Fujitsu. So that has been surprising how well that's worked. And it has worked better this year after we had a massive project to insulate and air seal a common attic. So that's our story, and we stand by it. Anything else, Steve? I would say Steve was very helpful. The worst part of the whole process is getting quotes from installers, because it's like comparing apples to broccoli. They just don't make it easy. And so I would say that's where Steve was particularly helpful in helping us sort of sort through. We use Steve as a coach to really compare the options. And I would definitely encourage people to get more. 3 quotes was great, but at least 2 quotes. You learn something from every vendor.
Thanks, Ellen. Yeah, I'm just going to share one slide that I didn't present previously to get across this idea of.
Just going to say one thing. This is a 25-year decision. Like, I didn't want to make a decision we will regret. So if we cared about climate, we cared about all this stuff, we just said, we have to make this decision that we're going to feel good about as the social norms change, as heat pumps become the norm. So it was a little scary, but it's been okay.
Thanks.
I'll add to that, Ellen. We did this before the incentives kick in, so the economics are just different than they were even a couple of years ago.
I think you can you see my screen now?
Yeah, we can. We see one graph of the average daily temperature.
All right, good. All right, so I just wanted to get across to folks, because it's a little bit nerdy stuff, nerdy and complicated. This idea of partial home electrification, which is what you're doing. So if you look at the number of days per year at different average temperatures, you can see, of course, there are cumulatively now very few days. It's just 1 or 2 days where the average temperature is below 10 degrees. And then as you increase the temperature, more and more days per year are at that average temperature. So what this means is that if you set your crossover between so let's say above 30 degrees, you use the heat pump, below 30 degrees, you use the backup system, you can actually displace about 50% of the heat load with the heat pump if you set the swap over at 30 degrees. If you go a little lower to around 20 degrees or just below 20 degrees, you can displace 85% of the load. And in general, this will, there's a corresponding reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So it's really, and this threshold of where you switch over between the heat pump at higher temperatures, because it's more efficient at higher temperatures, at least the air source heat pumps are, and the backup system is something that's settable in the system, and depends on what fuel you're using. If it's oil, then the state's actually recommending now a swap over of 15 degrees. If it's gas, then you might consider a higher swap over, because gas is cheaper relative to cheaper than oil, of course, is a heating fuel, and cheaper relative to electricity. So this is and as energy prices change over time, this is sort of a knob that can be turned to adjust your heating costs. So this gives some idea of what the displacement is. For fuel oil, you might want to be in the 15-20 degree range. For natural gas, 30 to 35%, and not have any impact on your heating costs, yet achieve substantial fossil fuel displacement. So now I'm going to stop share, and let's do a little mini coaching with Sheila and Norm. So I have when I start a coaching engagement, I have a questionnaire, a homeowner questionnaire that I sent to Sheila, but she politely ignored it. So I'm going to ask.
I never got it.
You never got it? Oh, okay.
No, we talked. I never got it, the questionnaire.
Oh, I think I was supposed to send it to you. After
Yeah.
I'm sorry for slighting you. So what I need to know, in order to provide coaching, I need to know a fair amount of information about the home and about the homeowner's priorities. So let's start with a little bit about your home. Tell me how it's heated today. What type of fuel and what type of distribution system do you have?
We have natural gas, with the exception of the master bedroom addition, which is radiant heat from the ceiling. The rest of the house is natural gas, and there are 3 zones, 2 zones downstairs and 1 zone upstairs.
Okay. And the natural, it's distributed. How does the heat actually get into the rooms? You mentioned
Forced hot water.
Yeah.
Forced hot water.
right. So it's a hydronic heating system.
Yeah.
And do you have air conditioning in the house?
We
Yes
do.
and no.
Yeah. Yeah,
I also
we
do
do.
couples therapy, by the way.
We have a split system. When we built the house originally, we ducted the house for a split system, but only installed air conditioning on the 2nd floor. And 20 years ago, when we put a kitchen addition on, we added the system to the ground floor, to the 1st floor.
Okay. So you have 2 condensers outdoors.
Right, one of which no longer works, and that would be the one for the downstairs,
Downstairs.
which we don't use that much anyway.
And that's understandable. The cool air from the upper floor.
Right.
probably.
Right.
Now, and the radiant heat that's in the bedroom, is that with a hot water loop, or it's electric? Or-
No,
No, it's electric.
Yeah, it's electric,
All right. So here we have a home that's had a couple additions, and
right,
typical of this area, it's got a mishmash of different heat distribution, but for sure that electric radiant heat in your bedroom is not inexpensive to operate. That would
Yeah.
be something that you'd want to change. And what I would, and then tell me a little bit about what your priorities are, how long you expect to be in the home, and
Oh. So the standard answer we give is, as long as Norman can continue to play tennis and I can continue to cook and entertain, we'll stay in the home. It's hard to know. Hopefully 10 years, would you say?
Yeah.
Ideally,
Okay.
but that may not be realistic.
okay. And all right, so your home, because it's got this, one other question is where the ducting for the ground floor is. Where is it? It's you have a air handler somewhere in the basement probably, and that ducting is in the basement or running up?
Yes, yes, there are vents. I'm just trying to think. There are vents in all of the downstairs room, ceiling vents.
Oh, there's ceiling vents, but
Yeah.
do you know where the air handler is for those vents?
Do you know where it is?
I think it's in the attic.
Oh, right.
It's in the attic.
Okay. So this is one of these. This is actually one of these situations that I encounter where they're not obvious answers. So if
No.
if the air handler was in the basement, then and the ducting was there was some ducting in the basement with some runs going up to the
Yeah.
rooms above, then it would probably be a no-brainer to put in a central to replace your central air conditioning condenser with a heat pump and just do the integration that's required to take advantage of that mass save partial home electrification. But when the air handler's in the attic, then actually another question, these are all questions that we would have gotten to in my questionnaire.
If you had said it, yeah.
What's going on in your attic? Is that insulated? And
Ah,
Yes, we put in
Air-
aircrete foam insulation.
Hmm.
Ooh,
15
15 years ago,
15,
maybe.
18 years ago. Yeah.
So the attic has all of that.
uh,
I don't know how long that lasts.
yeah,
Mostly a long time.
I'm not actually familiar with that particular product, but is the insulation on the floor of the attic or it's
Yes, on the floor, not on the ceiling.
So, the dilemma here is that the air handlers are above the floor, so they're in unconditioned space, which is not ideal. And the ducting is also above the floor, so it's unconditioned. And even if it's insulated, you're going to.
It's very well insulated.
Okay. All right. So, do you know what the R value is, Norm?
No.
Ooh, was it a 7? Why do I think it may have been a 7, Steve? This was the what Al Gore, so it was, we did this during that period when this was his thing. This is what he used in his home that he wrote up.
Yeah, you're talking about the insulation in the attic. not
The aircrete.
Aircrete.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The ducting itself probably at best has R8. It might even be the older standard, which is
Yeah.
R4. So imagine you're blowing warm air through that ducting and it's losing heat to the attic, which is, it's basically sending the heat up. And on top of that, the ducting may have some leaks in it. So it's a situation where you want to talk to the installers. The options, given a 10-year horizon, it might make sense to put in a heat pumps in place of the central air conditioner. However, operating them when it gets really cold outside won't make a lot of sense because of this heat loss to the attic. The ideal, this, when I've encountered these solutions and thought about it and done some analysis, it might make sense to abandon the ducting and put in a ductless mini split system.
That's what I wondered.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
a question.
Yeah, when you were talking about that, I kind of took notes on that.
Yeah.
And this whole thing started because the kitchen addition is built over the carport. We converted, made a carport. And what we noticed is that's the cool room in the house. That room is much cooler than the rest of the house. And we thought, well, gee, maybe a heat pump in that area would solve the problem.
Yeah, and Sheila, I'll just reveal, you and I talked last week, and you're also thinking about having some more insulation in the
Right.
floor.
Yes. Yes.
Right.
And that's something that Mass Save may be able to subsidize and do for a Mass Save.
Yeah.
You're shaking your head, Norm.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
don't think so.
Well, the
We've looked into
problem,
it. Yeah.
we're looking into it, and I'm looking at the comparison between the cellulose and the foam, the closed cell foam,
Yeah.
which looks like it gives you better insulation overall and doesn't need to be enclosed.
Uh-huh.
And I think that for our needs, it might be a better solution.
Yeah, so I think that probably for a home like that, unfortunately, probably the best, from an energy viewpoint, the best thing might be to abandon the ducting, close off those
Yeah.
the openings to the attic, and go with a ductless mini split system.
Yeah.
But that, and it'd be a matter of what the cost of that. But also could be if there's 2 air handlers in the attic, it can be quite costly to replace those, and that would as part
Yes.
of
Yes, yes.
sold as well. So
Yeah.
you might, this is a situation where the installers are the experts. You'd get maybe 3 good installers in there and talk to them about this and your intention of, wanting to do part of the heating with a heat pump and take advantage of new mass save incentives. And see what- it wouldn't surprise me if at least 1 or 2 of them propose a ductless mini split in place of just replacing.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Steve, there are a couple of questions in the chat that maybe we can kind of turn to. There are a couple of questions about a comment that Ellen made about how it doesn't make financial sense to turn the thermostat down at nighttime, turn it back up during the daytime, or when you go away for a couple hours or a day or 2 type of thing. So 2 questions. One is, why is that? And secondly, is that still hold true if it's, say, you're going away for a couple of weeks at a time? And does it still make sense to keep the temperature the same, or is there some period of time where it does make sense to turn it down?
Yeah, good question. So first of all, I would say, there's some, if you wanted to, for comfort reasons, make the home a few degrees cooler at night, that's certainly doable with a heat pump. A lot of this has to do with the capacity, the sizing of the system. With conventional fossil systems, they're typically oversized by a factor of 2 or more. They have a lot of extra capacity. And so if the heat's turned down 10 degrees at night, they can recover to the desired temperature very quickly because they have all that extra capacity. With heat pumps, they need to be sized more closely to the actual requirement of the home. And if you oversize them, they can actually be quite inefficient at warmer temperatures, which is where they spend most of their time operating. So in order to size them properly, they have to be sized very close to the heating needs of the home, and they can maintain the home's temperature even when it gets cold out. But if you're asking the heat pump now to recover from a 10-degree setback or something like that, the heat pump is going to run for hours at high capacity, its top capacity, to try to recover. And on a super cold day, it may not be able to recover actually. So it has to do with the sizing requirements particularly for air source heat pumps, and the advice not to oversize them. But that said, you can do small setbacks for comfort reasons. If you like it a few degrees cooler in the bedroom at night, by all means go and do that, and the heat pump will recover, and there'd be very little or no efficiency penalty from doing that.
So, and then if you're like Neil and you just moved to Florida for weeks and months at a time, if you're away for a long time, does it then make sense to go ahead and drop it down?
Absolutely. Yeah, set it back and let it run at the lower temperature. Just know that when you get home, if you don't have a backup system there, you might be waiting either when you're in the airport in Florida, get on your phone app to, a lot of the newer systems have phone apps, so you can control them remotely, get on that phone app and set the temperature higher so it'll be comfortable when you get home, or expect that it'll be take a little longer to get comfortable once you get home.
Oh, good. I can still go to Florida then.
Only if you give us all your address.
Yeah, we usually give it like 3 or 4 hours. You just set it to go on 3 or 4 hours before we're home, and that always works fine.
And Ira has a great question. classic problem of Mass Save giving out information that may or may not have relevance or accuracy. How are the incentives varying depending on what you have currently? His sense was, he was told that there are no incentives for homes that are currently heated by natural gas. It's only the guys who've got the fuel oil or something like that.
Actually has changed, Ira. This year, for the first time, they are giving incentives for the heat pumps are the same for natural gas customers as for oil and propane customers. So that's one of the big changes this year in the Mass Save program. This said, the changes are so dramatic in Mass Save that I've just heard from one of my coaching clients. She tried to call Mass Save and got the runaround from multiple calls there. And so I think the program right now is in a bit of disarray from that report. There's also, the installers are also somewhat confused. So right now, some of the installers won't be familiar with the new rebate program. And so the changes that were made this year, which are all very positive from my point of view, and many people who've been following it, are pretty disruptive to the Mass Save program.
And then a question about, you talked about installers. There's a lot of interest in heat pumps. So how does someone says, okay, I'm ready to go, I want to get some quotes. Where do they go to get a list of reputable installers?
Yeah, that's another one of the questions I get frequently. I have a short list that I give out to coaching clients, but usually with some guidance based on what type of system they're looking for and where they're located. Because the installers, somebody who's your friend in, let's say, west of 495 had an installer they like, that installer may not serve your home in Newton. It doesn't make sense for them to send their trucks all the way to Newton. And so the better installers, in my experience, have well-defined service areas. And so it depends where you live. And then it may depend on what type of system. There's some systems, like there's a company, I don't want to mention particular names on this call because that's one of the areas. So I would say if you can get help from a coach like me, we'll give you a few names. I'm not trying to hoard the names, but I'm just don't want to be in the business of, telling you, giving you a list of installers and then you may have a bad experience. I've had installers that 5 people like, and then one person has a bad experience. So it's highly apocryphal. I would say talk to other people, ask your friends and neighbors who they used and whether they liked them or not. I know there's an installer that a number of my neighbors have used that they liked. I called them and the salesperson was unresponsive to my questions, so I didn't proceed with them. But I've had other people use them. Different salesperson shows up to your house and you have a whole different experience. So it does take some effort to find a few names. There are a few that I particularly like and generally have good experiences with, but even with those installers, they may recommend, had one of the favorite installers do a heat pump to replace, it was actually a dual fuel propane and heat pump, and they set the crossover temperature at 30 degrees, and that home was now operating with a crossover of 15 to 20 degrees quite successfully. So they just, and with propane, it was cheaper to set that crossover lower, but even though this installer is knowledgeable, they gave what I considered the wrong advice there.
I mean, I'm happy to say that we used Rodenheiser and had a good experience with them. So that, doesn't say they'll always do a good job, but I'm certainly happy to say that was the installer we used. And we got quotes from several others. I do think you have to also think about the installer and then how you're going to get service, in any HVAC decision. So the service area and where they're going to provide service is an important thing. So if you've liked who you've used before, and they've been good to you, there is, I don't know if the Mass CEC database, Steve, is still showing the number of heat pumps installed by vendors. Could people still look that up?
Yes, yeah. Yeah, there's a database on Mass Clean Energy Center. They did a rebate program from 2014 to 2019. They show the number of installations that each installer did in the area. However, that database is getting stale. I know we have Barry Shinegold on the call, and Barry's got a house on the Cape, and I think you found a good installer down there who wasn't listed in that Mass CEC database, or was maybe way down the list. I've forgotten how you found that installer, but yeah, you have to, there's a bit of trial and error to it for sure.
And Steve, while we're talking about contractors, you mentioned, and Ellen reiterated, don't wait until your system conks out, do it in advance.
Mhm.
Given that there's so much interest, how much lead time are we talking about? Is it weeks, months? How long does this process take?
I think you have to look at probably a couple months to get those 3 quotes you're looking for. And then it could take 2 to 4 months before they actually install the system. So you're looking at right now a 6-month process. I mean, it's, and there are reportedly some supply chain issues, but the installers have quite a backlog.
And Kip asks a question, actually just a quick one here. Neil asked a question about the questionnaire that you were going to send to Sheila and Norm.
Yeah.
Is that something you do as part of your discussion, or is that a list that would be just useful kind of starter questions for everybody? Questions, can you make that available?
Part of the discussion I do with you. It may help you think through what your priorities are. Help you prioritize things. If you go to if you're interested in getting coaching, we on the heatsmartalliance.org, there's a coaching section. You can put in a request there for a coach. We have coaches in 5 or 6 towns now, so depending where you live, we may or may not have a coach there. I sometimes I'll generally help Bethel members from any town, but Congregation Bethel members, and I help folks in Wayland and a few surrounding towns.
And I would also say, if you're on the JCAN site, under massenergize.org/JCAN, you can then go to the green heating and cooling action, and on steps to take, it says email Steve, and there's a link right to Steve. So that's what I'd love you to do. And I'd love you to put it on, this is on my to-do list. I'm planning to do this. So we then know which of you guys have it on your to-do list. So if we hear of some new piece of information around heat pumps, then it gives me a way to email you guys. So that's another, because remember, our goal is also, at least half of the households at Bethel have taken some climate actions, and we have a better understanding of what you're doing. So the next person who does a heat pump, we might profile all of you in we're moving from the climate mention of the month to the climate mention activity of the month. So we'll profile everyone who's doing heat pumps. So great for us if you can engage with the website so we can track what's going on.
All right, so we've got just a couple of minutes left, and I have a couple of closing things. So let me just do a quick search through the chat. These questions have been great, by the way. Thank you. There was a question that, let's see, scroll backwards here a little bit. Leslie had a question. You talked about different temperature set points, and if you live in Vermont, temperatures get colder, et cetera. Do the systems get more expensive as they can handle lower temperatures?
No. In order to qualify for the Mass Save rebates, they have to be have reasonably good specifications as what are called cold climate air source heat pumps. And so, once you get into, if you're going to put in a heat pump, you want to put in one that's at least on the Mass Save rebate list. They have a list of qualifying heat pumps. So if it doesn't qualify, that's a indication that you probably ought to not consider that, even if it's less expensive. There's also another organization called NEEP, NEEP.org, stands for New England Energy Efficiency Partnership. And they maintain a list of cold climate air source heat pumps. So there's sometimes pumps that are, even if they're on the mass save list, you want to check that they're also on the neep.org list to have suitable performance specs. But once you're in that category, you're not or to, to get better performance at cold temperatures generally.
And last question I have, and then I'll turn to closing ones. You talked up front about the insulation and the car and all that sort of stuff. So if someone, to start off, should they start with a mass save energy audit first, or what's the order of angle of attack here in terms of improving your home?
Yeah, I would definitely start with the mass save audit, because you have, in order to get the heat pump rebates, you have to have a mass save audit done within the last 3 years, I believe it is. And you can get those audits every 2 years anyway. So even if you had one a few years ago, you could get another one. They used to spend a lot of time replacing LED bulbs. That is gone now, starting this year. So they have to focus on insulation, and hopefully we'll be more aggressive in some cases. I know wildly more aggressive to find out what they do as far as insulation goes.
Hey, John, I'm just looking at that last question from Ira, because I really want Steve to hit this about every AC replacement should be a heat pump.
Yes. Yeah.
I was just saying, Ira has a question. I remember she hit that. Ira's asking about AC replacement. Every AC unit central must be replaced with a heat pump. That is the only choice. Right, Steve? You're muted, Steve. Steve, you're muted.
Yes, but we just heard a case with Sheila and Norm where, yes, you could put in a heat pump for Sheila and Norm, but you're pumping heat into the attic. I mean, it would be better to put in a heat pump there, but not great, to just replace it, so, but in general, I would say absolutely, if you're replacing a central air conditioner, it should be a heat pump. And
Ira's question was, I'm replacing AC, or I'm sorry to jump in, John. Is there a rule of thumb about how much more money it is we're spending on a heat pump versus an AC?
if it qualifies for the mass save rebate, the cost of the heat pump will be compensated by the mass save rebate.
So thank you, Steve. I want to thank you for giving us a really good primer on this stuff. I've put in the chat a number of resources that Steve mentioned, so click on those to save them in your browser. But if you don't, feel free to reach out. We have been recording this, and we'll post the recording of it here in a couple of days. I had 2 or 3 closing things. One, I mentioned, or Ellen mentioned, the JCAN Mass Energize site. If you've not already signed up for that, please do. Please let us know what you've done, what actions you've taken, what actions you're thinking of taking. It's just as important to think about what you could do. I mean, make a resolution and say, okay, by the end of March, we're going to do some thinking about whether or not we need to start replacing our heat pump. How old is our existing system? And it's amazing. If you just start doing with it, it kind of snowballs from there. Second thing, for those who live in Sudbury, May 2nd is your town meeting. There is a climate emergency article that'll be on the town meeting. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that when you get the warrant. If you want a copy of the text, I can send it to you. It will set up, if it's enacted, it'll set up a sustainability director. It'll mandate creation of a climate action mobilization plan for the town, and a lot of good stuff. So I encourage you to support it and check it out. Secondly, town of Wayland. If you live in Wayland, the Board of Public Works next week is going to be discussing, and I think voting in favor of setting up a composting program for homeowners, where you can bring your compost in special bags to the transfer station and have Black Earth Compost take it away for you. So great program. Encourage you to take advantage of it if you're not already composting your home. If you're not quite sure what composting your home means, we will be having a webinar later this spring on that, when there's no longer white stuff on the ground and you feel like walking outside to use your compost. We'll also be having one on electric vehicles later this spring, so Michael will be working on that. So I encourage you to be thinking about what actions you can take. And thank you again for coming. If you do have questions afterwards, feel free to reach out to me and I'll feed them to Steve, or you know where he lives anyway. So thank you all for coming.